lot of you are curious about the Luigi voice. It sounds exactly like this.
Hello, Mario. Hello, I'm Luigi.
Video game adaptations were pretty bad at one point. Now they're actually kinda good. We don't need to emphasize the entire history of video game movies and such. It's a fact ingrained into anyone's head past the age of 12 that the majority of them sucked. No talk about curses around here. I already deal with the YouTube algorithm on a weekly basis, but I think it's necessary to discuss why the recent adaptations we've been getting have been of a much higher quality than the ones in the past. Take one look at the average adaptation. Oh, your favorite franchise is Mario? There's barely anything video gamey about any of these movies apart from the occasional scattershot attempt at fan service, and despite having some charming moments,
Monkey!
They're just cheap-looking slop with barely any relevance to their source material beyond. I guess that's close enough. This is the most I'll go into when it comes to discussing the past, because I don't know about you, but the last few years have actually been pretty great for video game adaptations. Whether it's through film or television, people seem to have realized that the key to making a video game adaptation successful is to not strip everything of its identity and charm. What a concept. Although I guess I can't give too much credit, as a lot of these projects are being made with direct input from the companies involved with actually making the games, instead of just giving some hotshot Hollywood suits free access to the sandpit and hoping for the best. Oh, my sandcastle. And obviously not everything released these days is all that great, but it's good to commend the effort, you know? I mean, when you're past the era of video game movies being a loophole for German money laundering, I guess you can only go up. This video will be a look at plenty of recent video game adaptations, or at least programs and films based on existing video games. Actually, we'll just call them video game related media. It won't get me views in the title, but it makes more sense. The Germ. Also, most of these properties will be animated, partly because that's what I like reviewing on this channel, but also because a lot of people behind these projects have only now realized just how much better an animated property is at conveying the world and characters of a video game compared to a live-action film, with a bloated budget that does not justify the horrendous visual effects. I don't really have an ordered list to go by, so I'm just gonna vibe my way through this. Hit it, Envoy. The absolute horror that rushed through everyone's body upon seeing this poster, man. Like, food tasted different. The whole ordeal with Sonic's old design was such a fever dream, it still feels so recent despite how long ago it actually was. But the design change wasn't just an example of the people behind the film listening to criticism, or rather large groups of people gathering around the successfully cyberbully a corporation with "Hey! Cut that shit out!" But it also showed there were people behind the film who cared about Sonic as a franchise. They brought in Tyson Hesse to redesign the character, the trailer was given much more appropriate music and editing to match the tone, and then the film released and everyone decided, yeah, that was okay. But there's still no denying how respectable this film was beyond its quality. Sonic as a franchise has had an identity crisis for the better half of its lifespan, and the 2010s was arguably the most divisive the games had ever been. There was just a lack of direction, and the constant self-loathing from the games and social media pages just casually accepting, "Hey, I'm Sonic, did you know my games suck?" was not helping the sinking ship of a reputation. The Sonic movie was not just a surprisingly decent video game movie, but it's done a ton of heavy lifting for Sonic's reputation. It was the last box office success before, well, the franchise itself became more popular with a new generation of kids playing the games, the sales for the games were higher than ever, the sequel to the movie released, which was even better, then Frontiers released, and despite it being a 7 out of 10 game, it still gave a good enough impression that added onto the huge wave of success the franchise is currently surfing on. Who would have thought that a movie everyone assumed was doomed to fail would rebound in such a tremendous way that ends up catapulting one of gaming's most troubled icons back into the spotlight? I don't even think it was planned like some people were saying, although for Frontiers I am more willing to buy that despite how successful that game's underdog story was too. But enough about that. The first Sonic movie isn't a mind-blowing spectacle or anything, it's a run-of-the-mill cartoon character enters reality story but with Sonic. I mean, come on now, it's just what it is. And to its credit, it's a pretty charming movie that pays homage to the games in some areas, and Sonic, while pretty different to how he is in the games, is still a very likable iteration of the character, and he really does elevate the film. He's got an attitude I'd say is more in line with Adventure Sonic, and a lot of the reference humor ends up working because he grew up on Earth watching movies and acts like a total dork because of it. It's adorable, and his friendship with Tom brings a lot of heart to the film. Jim Carrey as Dr. Robotnik is just Jim Carrey doing his thing, not so much to mention there, he's pretty entertaining too. The first movie is alright, but it's the second movie that gets most of my praise. I still think it was a big mistake to have Sonic's first theatrical outing being in a live-action setting. The original Sonic movie from the 90s is still my favorite out of the three because it's animated and naturally works a lot better. But that doesn't stop Sonic 2 from including more aspects from the games, giving us Tails, voiced by their current video game VA, Colleen O'Shaughnessy, and Knuckles, voiced by Idris Elba. Oh my god, Knuckles voiced by Idris Elba. I'm always gonna prefer actual voice actors voicing these characters, but Idris Elba as Knuckles was something I never knew I needed. We have the ancient Echidna Tribe, the Master Emerald, more homages to set pieces from the classics, Super Sonic. It's not a case of, wow, they referenced the thing, this is a 10 out of 10. It's more so appreciating that a video game movie is finally embracing the video game aspects of it, and incorporating more of them into the story. It's still undercut by a lot of the unnecessary human stuff, but this is still a pretty fun movie. And massive respect for being the first piece of Sonic media in over 10 years to not treat Knuckles like a joke. Thank you. While rougher than the rest of them, sorry, I actually need to be shot. While rough around the edges, these are still some pretty decent films, and with the third movie releasing next year, giving us Shadow the Hedgehog, pretty much teasing us with a feature-length adaptation of Sonic Adventure 2, one of my favorite games ever made, by the way, I'd say these movies are in rather capable hands. So this isn't an adaptation, it's an anime set in the universe of Cyberpunk 2077. So technically it breaks the rules, but it's my video, be gone with you. Any video game related media is going to carry a negative stigma with it. So even if it isn't an adaptation, acknowledging that something video game related was actually halfway decent is worth noting. Halfway decent, alright, I'll stop with that. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is a fucking incredible show, and I can't stress that enough. And similarly to the Sonic movies, it managed to resurrect the franchise it was based on, bringing millions of people back into Night City to find it a lot more fun and stable than it was at launch. I have a Cyberpunk video, please watch it. And keeping people hooked for the game's future updates to add more content and continue to improve the experience. Edgerunners had a massive impact on the current reputation of Cyberpunk 2077, and it cannot be understated. What most people generally agreed about when it came to Cyberpunk was that the story and writing was the strongest part of the game. Despite the narrative being rushed towards the end and every sentence is littered with F-bombs, it was still a very engaging narrative with compelling characters. So when you combine the writing talents of CD Projekt Red with one of the most highly praised anime studios in Japan for a Cyberpunk story that takes place within this world that's been painstakingly crafted, well, let's say it would have been shocking if it was anything less than stellar. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is visually spectacular. This is easily some of Studio Trigger's best work. Every area from the game has been brought to life lovingly, the action scenes are chaotic, and the scenery is beautiful. It's a perfect way to illustrate Night City, and it's the perfect backdrop for the story. It's a cyberpunk story at heart, so a happy ending is obviously off the table, but watching David climb through all the misery that surrounds him, the loss of his mother and friends, rising to become a Night City legend while losing himself to cyberpsychosis, rising up against the system and going out in a blaze of glory, it's extremely compelling, and each episode had me hooked. The characters are incredibly memorable and impressionable, how you're quickly endeared to them, how they all have their own stories beyond being David's crewmates only to be quickly snuffed out of nowhere. While there's an obvious shock factor to a lot of the death scenes being so sudden, it only further emphasizes how dangerous Night City is and how the people you care for can be taken away within an instant. It's a show that isn't afraid to kill off characters, often in an incredibly brutal fashion, and while some are gone too soon, it's hard not to feel the impact. The fact this series was able to accomplish so much with only 10-20 minute episodes allowed us to grow attached to these characters to the point of being heartbroken when they're taken away, and soaking us in the colourful but cruel and capitalistic dystopia that is Night City, all while never losing balance, is an act of brilliance. Edgerunners would definitely be better if it had more episodes and room to breathe, but what it manages to get done is nothing short of spectacular, exploring the many elements of Night City's hostile and all-consuming life cycle and emphasizing that an idealistic happy ending is impossible in a place like Night City. You will be abused by those in power, you will lose people, and no matter what path you take to enact your vengeance against the megacorps, your odds will always be out of favor, and the city will take its toll regardless of if you succeed.
Guess I meant, I don't know, a happier ending for everyone involved.
Here, for folks like us, wrong city, wrong people.
Encounters oh so queer, are sure to cause discomfort.
How's that for tonal whiplash? The first Angry Birds movie is one of the movies of all time. It was written, it was directed and animated, it carried some rather horrifying implications. Turning this simple phone game into a movie with a narrative and morals was never really gonna work out extremely well, especially when the premise of the movie relies on foreigners taking people's kids and then having the solution be blowing them to smithereens. Yeah, it's kinda yikes. Obviously I'm reading way too deep into that, but I feel that interpretation is why the pigs team up with the birds in the sequel. Okay, so why am I talking about Angry Birds 2 of all things? I don't know, man, I think it's pretty funny.
I'm in peace!
It helps that the director of this movie is Rob Van Orman, who created The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, which is one of my favorite Cartoon Network shows growing up, and the comedic timing is excellent. The film isn't very strong narrative-wise, but it's overall a solid and far more entertaining film than the first one was, where the highlight of the entire film was when the eagle pitched into a river, which sort of sums up Sony Pictures animation before Spider-Verse, honestly. I thought I'd throw this movie in here because I definitely think it's underrated. It's not gonna blow people's minds, nor does it have anything meaningful or insightful to say. Put the fedora down, we're talking about Angry Birds here. But it's pretty funny and a relatively easy watch, and a definite improvement over the first, which just sort of existed. And this one is slightly less bland, with more of a personality and a wacky sense of humor. While the plot isn't trying its hardest to incorporate parts from the games, that's also its greatest strength. Staying true to the source material is great, but when you have something with as little to go off of as flippin' Angry Birds, sometimes just making a goofy film is the better option.
In spite of passing fears, you choke it down. Shallow hopes.
Ladies and gentlemen, League of Legends. League has always had lore and characters with backstories, but no one ever really cared about that because they were too busy being hard-stuck gold. You know, not that I'm speaking from experience or anything. Which is why it came as a shock to pretty much everyone that the League of Legends animated series ended up becoming one of the most highly praised shows on Netflix, and it very quickly became one of my favorite animated series of all time. Arcane is a goddamn masterpiece, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Animation-wise, this is one of the most gorgeous and impactful blends of 2D and 3D I have ever seen. They work together seamlessly, the colors popping and emphasizing the power of the action to contrast the murky environments. The 2D artwork and shading help to give the series a painterly aesthetic, allowing the extremely detailed world to pop while emphasizing the rich history of Piltover. This show is some of the most meaty yet naturally implemented world building I've seen in a long time. Each scene is loaded with so much visual storytelling that hints at how big this world really is, along with the years of history behind everything you're looking at. All of it is given to you with very minimal exposition. It's a place that feels lived in. Every frame is a feast for the eyes, and it massively weaves this detailed world into a narrative of brewing conflict and social unrest that plagues Piltover, where living conditions are harsh and the penalty for stepping out of line is even more so as the public lives in fear of this authoritarian police state. The two main storylines that are contained within this world are just as engaging, from Vi and Jinx's side and the resulting gang war that rocks Piltover and Zon, and Jason Victor's side that explores the cost that advancements in technology have on their society. Each storyline has its own characters and brewing conflict, and none of the relationships, ensuing drama, the politics of the world, nothing overtakes anything. It's expertly crafted, and I feel the runtime of the season is just right and nothing feels like it's left with any remaining potential. It's a rare series that takes advantage of every single ingredient to create something absolutely phenomenal. The storytelling is impressive, the world building even more so, and the animation just tops it off. Arcane and Edgerunners are quite unique compared to other entries in this video. Whereas most of the shows and movies I'm discussing are good representations of their respective games, these two show just how much potential there is for an adaptation to soar far beyond being a serviceable representation of a video game. I'm very excited for what Season 2 has in store and how it has the potential to be even better. Wishful thinking? Sure, but I have plenty of faith given how good Season 1 was and just how much lore and characters there are in League. If only they could balance the fucking game properly, then I'd be happy with that number. Okay, it's an rated Mortal Kombat film. What else did you expect? This is what I expected. Films that are not trying to be masterpieces always have a special place in my heart, because at its core, this is a pretty faithful adaptation of the games just from allowing actual gore. I only found out last year that there was an entire film series spawned from the original Mortal Kombat film, so I could be missing some of what actually made those films so memorable for people. Yeah, no, I lied. It's just unreal how long it took for a gory and violent Mortal Kombat film to exist. I mean, that was what drew people to the games back in the 90s. It was insanely violent compared to other fighting games, and while still being a solid fighting game. You can't tell me those controversies didn't play a part in making the franchise so popular. Also, including the cheesy delivery of "Get over here" makes this film so infinitely likable to me, so I don't really care what you have to say. It's not very good and is worthy of a ton of critiques, but it's miles better than whatever this was. And even as someone with limited Mortal Kombat experience, I was still able to watch this and be entertained enough. The Last of Us was one of the most notable games of the 7th generation that really pushed the idea of cinematic experiences in video games. It was breathtaking at the time to play a third-person shooter with this much cinematic finesse, and it helped that the original Last of Us told a pretty good story. Sure, it's set during something that's akin to a zombie apocalypse, so nothing special there, but it was largely carried by stellar performances and strongly written characters. Ellie and Joel's dynamic is so fondly remembered for a reason. Getting to see them grow close over the course of a long campaign, slowly growing an attachment to them time during these moments of vulnerability. It's done with a great sense of patience and helps to sell the game's dramatic conclusion even more, a conclusion that is still being discussed to this day. It's a world populated by well-defined and well-developed characters, one that's easy to lose yourself in. With this in mind, adapting The Last of Us into a TV show seemed like an incredibly easy task, and honestly, yeah, The Last of Us is a pretty good show, because it follows the storyline of the game almost to a T. Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey as Joel and Ellie is perfect casting, and I really enjoy their chemistry. They managed to sell a lot of the game's most impactful scenes very well. The sets and special effects are really good, and a lot of care was put into each scene to make it in line with the game's atmosphere and environments. In general, I found that the show actually did a much better job when it came to world building compared to the game. While the game is mainly focused on character writing and is a lot stronger for it, the show touches on some parts of the game that aren't super fleshed out without sacrificing much of the story's quality. So overall, I do really like The Last of Us, but I don't know why some of the changes were made or were even all that necessary when the blueprints are right there. Making the same story twice would be lazy, you gotta throw in some variation, and I understand that, but some of these changes are perplexing to say the least. A good chunk of the dialogue in The Last of Us feels incredibly genuine and human. There's all these little moments between characters where they'll have a brief bit of banter, will reflect on the environment, and generally their emotions were often far more subtle than they are in the show. Because the show, while having some of these moments, lacks a lot of them, and at times seems to really lean in on the show being incredibly dramatic and depressing, showing the characters brooding or being more outwardly emotional than they're known for being. It seems small on the surface, but changes like that can really alter how a character is viewed based on how believable and relatable they are, as well as how human they really feel. It really doesn't work for Joel, who spends the entire game suppressing a lot of his emotions. In general, the game is also far more subtle. It doesn't do the traditional Hollywood thing of making sure the audience understands things to an absolutely insane degree. It respects the player's intelligence. A lot of scenes in the show aren't nearly as subtle, and in some cases, upon axing that subtlety, new problems are created. Bill and Frank's hinted at relationship in the game is fully explored here, and it's honestly a pretty tragic and beautiful love story. I think it's incredibly well written on its own. But Bill in the game was supposed to be a dark reflection of Joel, a symbol for what Joel could become if he keeps shutting himself off from the world. Bill drove Frank to So while I do really like Bill and Frank's episode together, I feel like it really does undercut how smartly written Bill was in the game and what his presence meant to Joel. There's plenty of other changes, but I'll stop there. Overall, The Last of Us is pretty good, but I just think the game is the superior experience, something I can't say for the other entries here because they aren't just trying to tell the exact same story but in a different format. Admit it, most of you clicked on the video for this, and despite the film being a mere 2 weeks away as I'm writing this, I've been meaning to talk about it for a while. It's really funny how night and day the difference between this and a 90s movie is. Cyberpunk dystopia of dinosaur creatures and Princess Daisy, for some reason, completely washed away by this colourful, imaginatively designed and aesthetically immaculate world that is one-to-one with the Mario franchise. And that's because Nintendo is breathing down Illumination's neck. Miyamoto has a sniper aimed at Chris Meledandri every second of the day so that they don't fuck this one up. The original Mario Bros. Movie was not just a bad video game movie, it's universally considered one of the worst movies of all time, and bombed at the box office. Something this unidentifiable with its goddamn name and having such a horrendous reputation has made Nintendo incredibly protective of their IPs when it comes to adaptations of their work. It's why they're directly working with Illumination on this film, because while the actual quality of it is still relatively up in the air, Nintendo wants a film that accurately and positively represents their IP, and honestly, I think they've nailed that. The character designs are altered very slightly so they're a tad more expressive and easier to animate, and they all look great. In terms of paying homage to the games, there is something in every single scene so far. It's rich with detail, and seeing all of this scenery rendered with such eye-popping colors and lighting and bouncy animation is an absolute joy. This movie is visual eye candy. Although I greatly prefer when 2D and 3D animation are blended together, this is easily up there with some of the best looking 3D animated movies I've ever seen, just from the trailers and just from the fact that it's not trying to be ultra realistic or overly detailed. It relishes in such a cartoony and imaginative world. It passes expectations for what a Mario movie should look like in the eyes of many, and overall is an absolutely phenomenal looking film. However, this movie is obviously not out yet, so the rest of what I'm saying is going to be based on what we've seen in the trailers. I'm still not sure if the film is going to be all that great, but simply based on the fact that it's an adaptation of one of gaming's most respected and iconic franchises, this is going above and beyond anyone's expectations. Remember when this movie was announced? Fear. Everyone collectively agreed that handing the Mario movie to anyone but Illumination would have been a better choice. Illumination are known for making incredibly safe, marketable films that are made with the intention of making a large profit, which they always do. Despicable Me 1 is actually a really good film, but it gave us the Minions, so Whoops. Illumination's films are often bland and very predictable, while not offering much in terms of humor beyond trend chasing, resulting in jokes that end up being dated long before the film releases. Naturally, with this kind of reputation, I think everyone's fears were justified at first, although Nintendo being closely tied to the project had a lot of people hopeful. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, wait, what's that? Oh. Chris Pratt has hit the Pentagon. Yeah, everyone had the same reaction to this. The mere shock of Chris Pratt being cast as Mario sort of tainted everyone's view of the whole cast for a bit, because after about a week, a lot of people started warming up to the casting, specifically Jack Black as Bowser. No matter how you framed that was going to be an experience worth the price of admission. We finally got our first trailers towards the end of last year to this month, and to say this movie has rebounded is the understatement of the year. Everyone who was cast for their respective roles is doing a pretty solid job. I'm not the biggest fan of Pratt's Mario voice, I'm not really convinced he knows what a Mario is, but from what we've seen, he's doing alright. I don't think it's that bad. It's even pretty good in some places. It's certainly different, but I doubt this will ruin the film for me. Everyone outside of Chris, though, seems to be giving it their all. Charlie Day's voice fits Luigi like a glove, Anya Taylor-Joy works well as Princess Peach, and it's a little bit of feistiness that works for this version of the character being able to defend herself a lot better. Wow, I really need to slow down. I've seen people complain about Peach being independent, but this is not a new concept for the Mario franchise. I do think her personality is teetering a lot further into Daisy's territory. Daisy's kinda meant to be the more outgoing tomboyish character, but I don't mind this at all. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Seth Rogen as Donkey Kong was a decent surprise, and Keegan-Michael Key is actually acting his flippin' heart out as Toad. He manages to bring a good balance to Toad's voice that I honestly prefer over the games. And good god, Jack Black as Bowser is looking to steal every scene he's in. Jack Black is one of my favorite actors. I think he's a national treasure, and god damn.
Open the gates!
He brings such a new level of presence and actual intimidation to a character who never speaks audible sentences, all the while sounded like he's having a blast while doing it. I think if you go by how Bowser's written in the Mario RPGs, this is pretty in line with Bowser's personality while making him a lot more of a serious threat and being fun to watch. There's a lot more I could say, but the Mario movie is looking pretty darn good right now, and the marketing for this movie is absolutely crazy. From the trailers perfectly selling the film's visuals and performances, an actual website for the Mario Bros. Plumbing business containing a wealth of secrets to find, the trickling in of clips from the film to keep people satisfied online, posters everywhere, AMC built a warp pipe on their front door and I can see the lawsuits from here, and the overwhelmingly positive reception and anticipation the film has garnered tells me that even if it doesn't turn out to be a super film, it can at least be a fun one, and a worthy adaptation of a franchise that's been long due justice in this medium since the 90s. I had a more interesting way to end this video, but I lost it.